The Diplomatic Compliance Center reeked of sanitizer and bureaucratic smugness. Two scents that had somehow evolved to complement each other perfectly across 17 different species. Ambassador Ketvar adjusted his ceremonial breathing apparatus and regarded the human specimen seated before the evaluation panel with the sort of detached interest typically reserved for mildly curious bacteria samples. Designation: Candidate 47 Tertiary, he announced to his colleagues, each representing their respective species' stake in the hegemony's diplomatic corps. Species classification: Human. Planet of origin: Sol 3, commonly designated Earth in their primitive naming conventions. The woman, unremarkable by human standards, with brown hair pulled back in what their cultural files labeled a practical bun, and wearing the standard-issue gray jumpsuit provided to all evaluation candidates, sat with her hands folded. She hadn't spoken beyond answering direct questions with that particular brand of polite attentiveness that somehow managed to be more irritating than outright hostility. "Genetic purity assessment?" inquired Counselor Velshara, her mandibles clicking with barely concealed disdain. The Zephyrian delegate had never made secret her opinion that humans were evolutionary accidents, who'd stumbled into space travel through sheer cosmic mischief rather than actual intelligence. Ketvar consulted his tablet, though they all knew the results already. Catastrophically mixed. The specimen shows genetic markers from at least 6 distinct human subpopulations, with traceable lineage documentation extending back only 2.3 centuries. Beyond that, he made the gesture his species used to indicate something too worthless to merit proper disposal. 2 centuries, mused Director Paxthul from his hover platform, the ancient Chromarite, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd personally witnessed the rise and fall of 3 different galactic trade agreements. Even our shortest-lived member species maintain genealogical records spanning 800 years minimum. "Well," the human said, speaking up for the first time in 20 minutes, "my grandmother always said we were good at starting over." The comment landed in the sterile chamber with all the impact of a pebble dropped in an ocean. Ketvar didn't even look up from his notes. Family oral traditions are not recognized as legitimate historical documentation under Hegemony Protocol 15C. "Of course not," she agreed amiably. She also said the best stories never make it into official records anyway. Counselor Velshara's mandibles stopped clicking. That particular brand of casual insubordination wrapped in politeness was, she'd learned over decades of diplomatic service, the most dangerous kind. Humans specialized in it. "Perhaps we should address the candidate's proposed assignment," Director Paxthul suggested, clearly eager to move past what he undoubtedly saw as tedious formalities. "Trade liaison, 7th level clearance, stationed at the Meridian Hub." A position, Ketvar noted with what passed for satisfaction among his people, that typically requires demonstrated competence in multi-species commercial law, proven negotiation experience, and, most importantly, genetic documentation sufficient to establish credibility with major trading partners. The human nodded thoughtfully. "And I have none of those things." "Correct. So why am I here?" It was Director Paxthul who answered, his ancient voice carrying just a hint of something that might have been curiosity. "Because your application scores in the theoretical examinations were unprecedented. Your species has been part of the hegemony for exactly 47 years, during which time no human has achieved better than adequate marks on our standardized assessments. You, Candidate 47 Tertiary, achieved perfect scores in 17 different categories, including several where perfect scores were previously thought mathematically impossible." "Oh," she said, "that's nice." The silence that followed could have been packaged and sold as a strategic weapon. Director Paxthul's hover platform made a soft whirring sound as he leaned forward slightly, studying the human with the intensity of someone who'd just discovered an interesting new type of puzzle. "Nice," he repeated. "Well, yes. Grandmother always said I was good with patterns. She used to tell me stories about games people played, complicated ones where you had to think several moves ahead and understand what your opponents wanted even when they didn't know themselves." Counselor Velshara's secondary arms twitched, an involuntary response that indicated either extreme irritation or dawning suspicion. "What sort of games?" "War games, mostly. She said they weren't really games at all. Just people who forgot that winning wasn't the same as destroying everything in your path." Archive Keeper Tholmes, who'd been silent throughout the entire evaluation, suddenly straightened in his containment unit. The elderly Quintar had been appointed to this tedious duty as a semi-retirement position, a way to occupy his remaining years with bureaucratic trivia rather than the vast historical databases he'd tended for centuries. His species didn't experience surprise the way most others did, but his chromatophore patches shifted to a distinctly unsettled shade of amber. "War games," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested deeper currents of thought. "Your grandmother taught you about war games." The human smiled, the first genuine emotional expression she'd shown during the entire evaluation. She was amazing at them. She said the secret wasn't being the strongest or the fastest or even the smartest. The secret was understanding that everyone else was fighting the wrong war. Director Paxthul's hover platform made another soft sound, though whether from mechanical strain or the director's own, unconscious reaction was unclear. And what war was she fighting? The war nobody else knew was happening. Ketvar looked up sharply from his tablet. "Elaborate." She said most people fought wars to win battles, but battles were just distractions. The real war was always about what happened after everyone stopped shooting. The human's expression remained perfectly pleasant, as if she were discussing weather patterns or agricultural yields. She said the trick was making sure that when the smoke cleared, everyone involved was exactly where you needed them to be. Archive Keeper Tholmes' chromatophore patches shifted again, this time to a shade that members of his species typically reserved for encounters with the genuinely disturbing. He'd spent 600 years cataloging historical conflicts across 47 different species, and something about the human's casual description of strategic philosophy was triggering memories he'd thought were safely buried in restricted databases. "This grandmother of yours," Tholmes said slowly, "how long ago did she pass away?" "Oh, she's not dead. She just retired to a planet with really good fishing and terrible communication infrastructure. She sends postcards sometimes, usually when she catches something interesting." The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Director Paxthul's platform had gone completely silent, while Counselor Velshara's mandibles had locked in what appeared to be complete paralysis. Ketvar's breathing apparatus cycled twice before he managed to speak. "Retired," he said. She always said the best commanders know when to walk away." The human glanced around the chamber with mild curiosity. "Is everything all right? You all look like you've seen a ghost." Archive Keeper Tholmes made a sound that his species typically reserved for moments of existential terror. His chromatophore patches had shifted to deep violet, a color that indicated not just fear, but the specific kind of fear that came from recognizing something that should have remained safely theoretical. "What?" he asked, his harmonic voice barely above a whisper. "What was your grandmother's name?" Archive Keeper Tholmes hadn't run anywhere in 3 centuries, but he was running now. His locomotor appendages, designed for the careful, deliberate movement befitting a keeper of ancient knowledge, scraped against the polished floors of the Hegemony Archive complex with undignified urgency. Behind him, the evaluation chamber continued its session, blissfully unaware that their routine assessment had just detonated something that had been carefully buried for 800 years. The Quintar's species didn't experience panic in any recognizable mammalian sense, but his chromatophores were cycling through colors that would have sent his colleagues fleeing if they'd bothered to learn xenobiological stress indicators. Deep violet gave way to flashes of crimson, then back to the sickly amber that meant his mind was processing information it desperately wished it could reject. His private archive terminal recognized his biometric signature and powered up with mechanical indifference. Thalms interfaced directly with the system, his neural tendrils sliding into connection ports with practiced ease. The familiar sensation of database immersion usually brought him comfort. The orderly arrangement of cataloged information, cross-referenced and properly filed according to hegemony archival standards. Today, it felt like sticking his consciousness into a nest of venomous memories. Search parameter, human military commanders, historical reference period 8 to 9 centuries past, conflict designation unknown, he whispered to the system. His voice carried harmonic undertones of dread that the translation software completely failed to capture. The database responded with its usual efficiency. Classification level insufficient for requested information. Thalmes stared at the readout. In 600 years of archival work, he'd encountered exactly 3 pieces of information that required higher clearance than his archive keeper status provided. All 3 had involved planet-killing weapons that were subsequently banned by unanimous Galactic treaty. Override. Archive Keeper Emergency Protocol 7, he commanded, invoking a clause he'd hoped never to use. Justification. Potential security threat to current diplomatic operations. The system paused. Actually paused, as if the artificial intelligence running it needed time to consider whether this was a genuinely terrible idea, before responding, "Override accepted." Warning. Accessed information. Subject to automatic Hegemony Council notification. Files began cascading across his visual interface, and with them came the understanding of why the Hegemony's greatest military historians had agreed, by unanimous vote, to bury this particular chapter of galactic history so thoroughly that even the censorship had been censored. The Silence Wars. Even the name had been chosen to discourage curiosity. Not the human wars, not the Sol conflict, not even something dramatic like the Void campaign. Just silence. The kind of bureaucratic nomenclature that suggested nothing interesting had happened, certainly nothing worth investigating further. Thalmes began absorbing the recovered files, and immediately understood why his predecessors had been so eager to forget. 812 years ago, the Hegemony had been a different entity entirely. Younger, more aggressive, convinced of its own evolutionary superiority and manifest destiny to bring order to the chaotic Outer Rim territories. When long-range scouts had detected the Sol system, a modest yellow star with several rocky planets, one of which showed signs of primitive industrial civilization, the response had been predictably efficient. Subjugation Fleet Epsilon, comprising 47 warships representing the combined might of 6 different species, had been dispatched to incorporate this Earth into the Hegemony through the standard process. Overwhelming force followed by conditional surrender and grateful acceptance of galactic civilization. The fleet had vanished. Not destroyed. Vanished. No distress signals, no debris fields, no survivors. Simply gone, as if it had never existed. The follow-up fleet had found nothing but empty space and a single message broadcast from the planet's surface. "Thanks for visiting. Please don't come back." That should have been the end of it. The Outer Rim was full of inexplicable phenomena, from gravity storms to sentient dark matter. Fleets disappeared sometimes. The universe was larger and stranger than any single species could comprehend. But then the refugees had started arriving. Tholm's chromatophores shifted to deep purple as he absorbed testimony after testimony from survivors of conflicts across the Outer Rim. The Khajan Empire, which had controlled 14 star systems for 3 centuries, had simply stopped. Their fleets recalled, their expansion halted, their emperor issuing a single statement: "We have learned the value of contentment." The Vorthak hegemony, no relation to the current organization, had been the galaxy's primary slave trading operation. One day they'd opened their detention centers and released every captive, then dismantled their entire military infrastructure and retreated to their homeworld, where they'd apparently taken up agriculture. The Crimson Syndicate, whose asteroid-based mining operations had strip-mined entire systems, had voluntarily shut down their most profitable ventures and begun what they called sustainable extraction practices, a concept that previous generations of syndicate leadership would have considered grounds for immediate execution. Each former aggressor told essentially the same story when pressed. They'd encountered a single human ship. Nothing impressive, certainly nothing that should have troubled established military powers. The ship's captain had requested diplomatic meetings, which had been granted more out of curiosity than respect. Then, somehow, everything had changed. Tholm's pulled up tactical assessments from the period, cross-referenced with psychological profiles and strategic analyses. The pattern was always the same. The human commander never threatened, never demanded, never even raised her voice. She simply talked, asked questions, listened to answers, made suggestions. And within months, civilizations that had spent centuries perfecting the art of conquest found themselves embracing pacifism with the enthusiasm of religious converts. Subject identification: human female, designation varies by cultural context. Tholm's read from a Khajan military report. Referred to as she who speaks quietly in our records, the thoughtful death by Vorthak survivors, and grandmother of unexpected wisdom in syndicate testimonies. The archives, translation protocols couldn't quite capture the undertones of those alien designations, but Tholm's experience with historical linguistics filled in the gaps. These weren't terms of endearment or even grudging respect. They were the names traumatized civilizations gave to something that had fundamentally altered their understanding of power itself. His communication terminal chimed with an incoming priority message. Director Pax Thul's ancient voice carried across the chamber. Archive Keeper Tholm's, your recent database access has triggered automatic notification protocols. Please report to Emergency Council Session 12 Alpha immediately. Tholm's disconnected from the archive system, his neural tendrils withdrawing with reluctance. The database seemed almost eager to close itself, as if the information he'd accessed preferred to remain buried, as he prepared to leave his sanctuary of organized knowledge for the political chaos of an emergency session. One final detail from the historical files lodged itself in his consciousness like a splinter. The human commander's ship had been designated Quiet Retirement in every language that had encountered it. And according to the final entry in the restricted files, she'd sent a single message to the hegemony's governing council before vanishing from recorded history. I'm going fishing. Please keep the peace while I'm gone. That had been 800 years ago. Tholm's chromatophores settled into a steady shade of deep violet as he sealed his archive terminal and began the journey to what would undoubtedly be the most uncomfortable council session in recent galactic history. Somewhere in the evaluation chambers, a young human woman was probably still sitting patiently, waiting for her routine diplomatic assessment to conclude. The universe, he reflected, had a truly malicious sense of timing. Emergency Council Session 12 Alpha had been called exactly 3 times in hegemony history. The first had involved the discovery that dark matter was sentient and had been filing noise complaints. The second had dealt with a rogue artificial intelligence that had achieved consciousness and immediately started a successful catering business. The third was happening right now, and Director Pax Thule suspected it would make the previous two seem quaint by comparison. The chamber hummed with nervous energy as representatives from 47 species materialized via hologram, quantum entanglement, or in the case of the ethereals, pure indignation made manifest. Emergency protocols had dragged them from sleep cycles, mating seasons, and in one unfortunate case, a diplomatic dinner featuring foods that were only safe to consume during specific tidal conditions. "Explain," Ambassador Ketvar demanded, without preamble, "why my species' highest security databases are currently hemorrhaging classified files onto my personal communication array." Director Pax Thule's hover platform had developed a pronounced wobble, whether from age or stress was anyone's guess. "Archive Keeper Tholum's accessed restricted historical records approximately 47 minutes ago. The security cascade appears to be comprehensive." "Define comprehensive," snapped Fleet Commander Yex Tara of the Dominion Navy, whose battle-scarred exoskeleton bore witness to conflicts spanning 3 centuries. Her species didn't experience fear in any conventional sense, but the way her auxiliary limbs kept twitching suggested she was reconsidering that evolutionary advantage. Tholmis interfaced with the central display, his chromatophores now settled into a resigned shade of gray that his species typically reserved for natural disasters. Every major civilization represented in this council has restricted files that are spontaneously declassifying themselves. The system appears to be responding to what it terms genetic proximity alerts. The display filled with testimony fragments, each more disturbing than the last. Voices long dead spoke across centuries, their words preserved in formats ranging from crystalline memory matrices to quantum encrypted thought patterns. Commander Vex Noth of the Khajan Empire recorded 806 years ago. "She never raised her weapon, never needed to. When she spoke, it was like hearing mathematics explain why violence was inefficient. By the end of our conversation, continuing the siege felt embarrassing." Battle Mother Kresshak of the Vorthak hegemony, testimony dated 811 years past. "The human asked about our children, not as a threat, but genuine curiosity about how we raised our young. When I described our selection protocols, eliminating the weak, conditioning the survivors for aggression, she nodded and said, 'That must be exhausting.' 2 words. Exhausting. My entire worldview crumbled around that single observation." High Reaper Thexmol of the Crimson Syndicate, final recorded statement. "She requested a tour of our mining operations, seemed fascinated by the efficiency of our extraction methods, asked thoughtful questions about long-term sustainability and resource allocation. Then she said, 'You know, there's probably a way to do this that wouldn't require quite so much dying.' We spent the next 6 hours redesigning our entire industrial infrastructure. I still don't understand how it happened." The testimonies continued, each more unsettling than the last. Not because they described defeat. Military defeat was comprehensible, even honorable. These described something far more disturbing: voluntary transformation. Civilizations that had spent millennia perfecting warfare suddenly discovering better alternatives, and doing so with the enthusiasm of species experiencing genuine revelation. "Pattern analysis," Fleet Commander Yex Tara demanded, her voice carrying the controlled tone of someone desperately trying to remain professional while confronting the incomprehensible. "What tactical advantage did this human commander employ?" Archive Keeper Tholmis accessed additional files, his interface tendrils moving with reluctant precision. Cross-referencing multiple sources, the commander's primary strategy appears to have been listening. Silence fell across the emergency session like a physical weight. Ambassador Ketvar's breathing apparatus cycled several times before he managed to speak. Listening. Affirmative. According to recovered psychological profiles, the human demonstrated unprecedented ability to understand the underlying motivations driving aggressive behavior. Rather than countering violence with superior violence, she addressed the root causes that made violence seem necessary. The display shifted to strategic analyses, showing conflict resolution patterns that defied conventional military doctrine. Each encounter followed the same basic structure. The human commander would request meetings under neutral conditions, spend extensive time understanding her opponent's objectives, then propose alternative methods for achieving those same goals, with significantly reduced resource expenditure and casualties. She offered them everything they wanted, Tholmes continued, while demonstrating that what they thought they wanted wasn't actually what they needed. Counselor Velshara, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. The current human candidate in evaluation, her theoretical examination scores. Director Paxthal consulted his files with growing unease. Perfect marks in strategic planning, resource management, psychological assessment, and cultural integration protocols. And her response to our mockery of her genetic documentation? The director's hover platform wobbled more pronouncedly. She displayed no defensive reactions, no anger or embarrassment, simply acknowledged our position and remained pleasant. Classic psychological warfare, Fleet Commander Yextara observed, though her tone suggested she found no comfort in the recognition. Refusing to engage with hostility forces opponents to escalate or abandon their aggressive stance entirely. Basic tactical manipulation. Except, Tholmes interjected, accessing another batch of declassified files. According to biometric analysis from the historical testimonies, the original commander wasn't employing manipulation techniques. Her psychological readings indicated genuine curiosity and authentic interest in finding mutually beneficial solutions. The implications hung in the chamber like toxic gas. Military manipulation was understandable. It could be countered, prepared for, defended against. But genuine altruism coupled with strategic brilliance? That was something else entirely. That was what their ancestors had found so terrifying that they'd chosen to forget it ever existed. Additional data point, Tholmes announced, his chromatophores shifting to a particularly ominous shade of amber. The human commander's final communication to the previous. Hegemony Council contained specific details about her retirement plans, cross-referencing those details with the current candidate's casual comments about her grandmother's activities. He paused, interfacing with databases that were apparently unlocking themselves faster than he could read them. The match probability exceeds 94%. Location, activities, even the specific reference to catching something interesting appears in the historical record. Director Paxthul's platform finally gave up all pretense of stability and settled onto the chamber floor with a defeated mechanical sigh. Are you suggesting that the most strategically dangerous individual in recorded galactic history is currently living on a fishing planet and sending postcards? I'm suggesting, Tholmes replied, with the careful precision of someone delivering news that would reshape galactic politics, that her granddaughter is sitting in our evaluation chamber, waiting patiently for us to decide whether she's qualified for a mid-level diplomatic position. The emergency session dissolved into chaos as representatives began shouting in 47 different languages, each trying to be heard over species whose vocal ranges existed in entirely different dimensions. Through it all, Director Paxthul sat in stunned silence, contemplating the cosmic absurdity of a universe where legends came disguised as routine paperwork. Somewhere in the evaluation chambers, a young woman was probably wondering why her assessment was taking so long. And somewhere else, on a planet with excellent fishing and terrible communication infrastructure, a grandmother was quite possibly laughing at a joke that had taken 8 centuries to reach its punchline. The human woman had been sitting in the same chair for 2 hours and 17 minutes, occasionally glancing at the chronometer on the wall with the mild curiosity of someone wondering if lunch was running late. She'd declined offers of refreshments, entertainment, and alternative seating with the same polite consistency that had originally annoyed the evaluation panel and now filled them with creeping existential dread. When the chamber doors finally reopened, she looked up with bright interest. "Oh, good. I was starting to worry something had gone wrong with the assessment." The council members who filed back into the room bore no resemblance to the smugly confident bureaucrats who'd left. Ambassador Ketvar's ceremonial breathing apparatus had been replaced with emergency life support equipment after what appeared to have been a stress-induced respiratory crisis. Councillor Velshara's mandibles remained locked in a position that suggested permanent surprise. Director Pax Thule had abandoned his hover platform entirely and was being wheeled in on what could only be described as a very dignified medical cart. Only Archive Keeper Tholmes looked relatively unchanged, though his chromatophores had settled into a shade of resigned purple that indicated someone who'd accepted the universe's fundamental absurdity. "Candidate 47 Tertiary," Director Pax Thule began, his voice carrying the fragile quality of someone delivering a speech he'd never imagined needing to give. "After extensive deliberation, the Council has reconsidered your application." The woman brightened considerably. "Wonderful. I know my documentation was a bit lacking, but I really do think I'd enjoy the work." "Yes," the director continued, consulting notes that trembled slightly in his grasp. "About that, we'd like to discuss alternative positions that might better utilize your unique qualifications." "Such as?" "Supreme Admiral of the Combined Fleets, for instance. Or perhaps Sector Governor of the Outer Territories. We could also create entirely new positions, Galactic Peacekeeping Coordinator, Strategic Wellness Director, that sort of thing." She blinked twice, processing this information with the same mild attention she'd given everything else. "That's very flattering, but I was really hoping for something in trade liaison work. I like the idea of helping people find mutually beneficial arrangements." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Ambassador Ketvar made a sound that his breathing apparatus translated as either laughter or a death rattle. "Mutually beneficial arrangements," Director Pax Thule repeated slowly. "Exactly. People often think they want different things, but usually they're just approaching the same goals from different angles. Trade negotiations must be fascinating. All those opportunities to help everyone get what they actually need instead of what they think they want." Archive Keeper Tholmes interfaced with his portable terminal, accessing psychological assessment protocols developed specifically for this moment. The results appeared on his screen with bureaucratic efficiency. Genuine response probability, 97.3%. Deception indicators, none detected. Strategic misdirection, inconclusive due to subject's apparent complete sincerity. "You're genuinely interested in a 7th-level trade liaison position," Councillor Velshara managed to say, her voice carrying harmonics of bewildered terror. "Well, yes, it seems like meaningful work. And the posting is at Meridian Hub, right? I've heard they have excellent recreational facilities. I'm hoping to take up fishing during my off hours." The silence that followed this casual mention of aquatic leisure activities was profound enough to register on seismic equipment. Director Pax Thule's medical cart emitted a soft beeping sound as his vital signs achieved new levels of distress. "Fishing," he whispered. My grandmother always said it was wonderfully relaxing. Just you, the water, and the satisfaction of patience rewarded." She says the secret is understanding that the fish aren't really the point. It's about learning to think like the ecosystem instead of fighting against it. Fleet Commander Yex Tara, participating via emergency hologram due to what her species called tactical recalibration syndrome, spoke up from her command ship. And your grandmother taught you this philosophy? Among other things, she's full of practical wisdom about working with natural systems instead of trying to dominate them. She says most conflicts happen because people forget they're part of something larger instead of separate from it. The woman paused, tilting her head with genuine concern. Are you all feeling all right? You look like you've seen something disturbing. Thalm's chromatophores cycled through several shades of resignation before settling on deep violet. We're experiencing what your species might call historical vertigo. Oh, well, if it helps, Grandmother always said the past is just context, not destiny. People can choose to learn from it or be trapped by it. She smiled with the same pleasant warmth she'd maintained throughout the entire evaluation. She's very wise about that sort of thing. Director Pax Thule summoned his remaining diplomatic training and managed to speak with something approaching professional composure. Very well. 7th level trade liaison position at Meridian Hub, as originally requested. Standard posting duration of 5 years, with options for extension or transfer based on performance evaluation. Perfect. When do I start? Immediately, if you prefer. We can arrange transport within the hour. She stood up, smoothing down her jumpsuit with brisk efficiency. Excellent. I'm looking forward to getting busy. Nothing like meaningful work to keep you occupied until retirement. The phrase hit the chamber like a physical blow. Archive Keeper Thalm's terminal chimed frantically as it cross-referenced those exact words with historical databases. The match was perfect, down to the specific harmonic patterns in the human language. Until retirement, Ambassador Ketvar repeated, his voice barely audible through his emergency breathing apparatus. Well, yes. Eventually I'll want to settle down somewhere quiet, maybe take up fishing seriously. She gathered her few belongings, a single bag containing what appeared to be personal items, and a manual on interspecies commercial law. Grandmother says the key to a good retirement is picking a planet with interesting fish and terrible communication infrastructure. She paused at the chamber door, turning back with a helpful expression. Oh, and thank you for the thorough evaluation process. I know it was more complicated than usual, but Grandmother always said the important things are worth taking time to get right. With that, she walked out of the chamber with the same unremarkable competence she'd displayed throughout the entire proceedings, leaving behind a council of beings who were slowly coming to terms with the fact that they'd just witnessed the most human thing imaginable. Someone becoming accidentally terrifying through the simple expedient of being exactly who they appeared to be. Archive Keeper Thalms stared at his terminal screen, where historical databases were finally closing themselves with what seemed like relief. The restricted files were sealing shut, the emergency protocols were standing down, and the galaxy's most carefully buried secret was walking toward Meridian Hub with a trade manual and absolutely no idea that she'd just redefined the word legend. Director Pax Thule's medical cart began wheeling him toward the exit, its automated systems recognizing that he needed immediate rest after what would undoubtedly go down as the most successful diplomatic assessment in hegemony history. As he passed Thalm's, he managed to whisper a single observation that would become the unofficial motto of Emergency Council Session 12 Alpha. The universe has a truly disturbing sense of humor. And somewhere on a planet with excellent fishing and terrible communication infrastructure. A grandmother was probably checking her mail, wondering if her granddaughter had gotten that job she'd applied for.